Hello everyone. I felt like making a video about the meanings of the lines of the hexagram. And I figured I'd have to make a video like this because I just talked to someone recently who I just really assume that a lot of people know what certain things are, even though they probably really don't. And that's probably just something I might do too much, but I can't. It's hard for me to slow down sometimes and explain some really fundamental stuff, even though I try to explain fundamental things. Because when I stop and think about it, I realize some people might watch some of my videos on human design, or even when I evoke it to talk about the structures of it and whatnot. Um, Stuff that's really obvious to me and that seems really simple to me, it just seems really complex and wild to other people, while at the same time still kind of interesting, like they want to investigate it more, but it's just too seems like too much at the moment. So I'm just going to do something real basic here and discuss the structure of the hexagram itself. And the hexagrams come from the ancient system of the I Ching that's been around for about 5,000 years or more. And each hexagram is composed of 6 lines, either solid or broken lines. The solid lines are yang, masculine, and the broken lines are yin, feminine. And each one of these hexagrams has 6 of these, and there's 64 different combinations of either having solid or broken lines in any of these 6 lines. There's 64 possible combinations with these, which give you the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching. But we're not going to be exploring all the different meanings of these hexagrams. We're going to be looking at the basic hexagram structure, what these lines actually mean. So you can see here that we're looking at the basic hexagram structure. You count from the bottom up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from the bottom up. Now, the interesting thing about the hexagram is that it seems simple, but it's kind of complex. Like there's things going on within it. There's patterns within this very basic, simple structure. It's sort of like how in numerology, numbers build upon one another. You want to define something, you have to look at its environment. Sort of like how in numerology, if you want to understand, say, the number 2. The number 2 is a bridge between 1 and 3. And when you look at the meanings of the 1, you see that it sort of grows into 2. You know, the 1 being very individualistic and wanting individual experience, but then when moving into 2, you're looking at more other people, looking for allies, looking at contrast between things. It's not just about you. And that kind of thing. And each number builds upon one another in that sense. It's the same kind of thing with the I Ching, but it's divorced from numerology in that sense. There are some similarities, but not very many that are significant. Not many that you would want to draw too many correlations between, because the systems are just so different that it's not necessarily wise to be trying to use numerology with either the I Ching or human design. I mean, you might find some interesting things here and there. I know people out there who do a lot of gematria with things, and they've done it with human design, and they're finding interesting things. I just personally don't do that. It's okay if you're good at that stuff, like really good at it, and you want to explore, go ahead. I'm just saying, this is a pure system that stands on its own feet, that you have to look at for what it is without blending it too much with other things. So, here we have the hexagram structure. The first thing you'll notice, of course, is that there's 6 lines, but what you want to do is understand that each hexagram is made up of not just 6 lines, it's made up of 2 trigrams. You have a lower trigram and you have an upper trigram. You could say that the lower trigram represents more of the personal self and personal identity, more of a personal journey, whereas the upper trigram has more to do with other people and being more transpersonal and dealing with other people, dealing with groups of people. Another way to look at the hexagram is as the structure of a house. This is one way that Ra always described the hexagram structure. The first line is the investigator, that makes sure that the basement and the foundations of the house are in order. It's very introspective, and it's looking very closely at things and making sure that everything works. This is why people who have a lot of first lines might be a little anxious about things. It does have a lot of ties to science and scientific investigation, actually. I mentioned once that a friend of mine, he wrote an article about how at the very root of science and scientific endeavor is anxiety, the physical feeling of anxiety, the anxiousness of needing to survive and surviving into tomorrow and that kind of thing. Making sure we have firm foundations. That really makes sense. And it also ties to human design quite a bit. When we move to the second line, you could think of each line rests upon the line below it, so to speak. The second line rests upon all of that work that the first line did in building the foundation, making sure the quote-unquote plumbing works, making sure that everything can be built upon it very well, and very easily with all of its worry and anxiousness. Now, that's not to say if you have a bunch of first lines, you're always anxious and a worrywart, but it does mean you are what you could call concerned a little bit, and you're very involved in a process that involves deep inquiry. But when you move to the second line, it's interesting because the second line rests upon that. It rests upon that, which means the second line has to do with being a natural. It's the first floor of the house where a person sort of comfortably just lives. Comfortably lives. One of the ways Ra talked about it was like, it's as if the person is very natural, might have natural gifts, like a kind of genius where they don't know where it comes from because that first foundation was already laid. So they're sort of have these gifts and they're on the first floor of the house. They're not concerned with what's going on in the basement. They don't need to be concerned. Things are just happening for them. But the thing is, that first floor has a picture window in the front, and everybody can sort of look in and see what this person's doing. Maybe they're really good at guitar. Maybe they're really good at things. But it's still in the lower trigram, meaning that very personal world. One of the keynotes of the second line is the hermit. Whereas, a keynote for the first line is the investigator. Keynote for the second line is the hermit. And the hermit just sort of wants to be left alone to do his thing. They're really good at things, and they're still in the lower trigram quite a bit, They're not even bumping up to the upper trigram like the third line is. They're still very deeply in that personal process, and they just kind of want to be left alone with the stuff that they like to do and the stuff that they're good at. But we'll talk about how this relates to the upper trigram in a minute after I move through all these. So you have the second line that's just sort of resting upon the first line. Now, when we get to the third line, you could say it's a bit more kinetic. It's on a staircase or a ladder that's going up to the second floor, because you got the first floor, which is the lower trigram. The second floor is the upper trigram. The third line is that staircase or that ladder that is going up to the second floor, meaning more transpersonal. A little less to do with the self, but more transpersonal. But it's still in the lower trigram. So it's interesting with the third line and the fourth line, Ra would say that they're a little unstable, meaning they're open to mutation. because they're so close to that boundary uh, between the trigrams. You know, the third line is very close to the upper trigram and is bumping right up against it, even though it's not completely in it. And the fourth line is very close to the lower trigram and bumps really close against it, even though it's not completely in it. It's in the upper trigram. So you could say that the third line has a sensibility that it can sort of bump into. And that's one of the things with the third line. It can bump into the upper trigram world of other people. It's still very deeply personal, but it's bumping into things. And it experiences things sort of by accident, through chance, and it's sort of how it experiences the world. It has all this stuff that it's resting upon, sort of like with the second line, with all the naturalness of it. It has all this natural stuff, but it's trying to uh, do things with them and weigh them, in a sense. The third line is quite materialistic, but not materialistic in like a negative sense. Materialistic in a way of trying to understand how things work. It has to do with like a kind of friction between things. Uh, and it's a trial and error process with that kind of stuff. You try something and it's not natural how with the second line everything's sort of smooth going with the second line. With the third line it's a little different. Things get moving a bit quicker. And it's one of these lines of evolution that wants to evolve forward, but in order to evolve forward, you have to have what we call mistakes. And you have to have what we call bumps and scrapes and bruises and things like that. This is partly why the third line has the keynote of the martyr. The person who is quote unquote sacrificed by dint of his own genetic programming to come up against mistakes and to try things and go through many experiences that don't necessarily work out every single time. It's not easy, quote unquote, like it is for the second line. And not to say that everything is easy for a second line personality, but just that the third line is moving beyond that and getting a little into different territory where it has to try many different kinds of things to find what it's good at through trial and error. And lots of things are found through that process. Many things that don't work, and many things that do work. And when a third line finds things that do work, it gets really, really excited about it because it's already went through many things that don't work. So a lot of third line people, they are sort of the Mr. Fix-Its, the trial and error people who've been through so many things, and then but they have a list of what doesn't work, and they can tell you exactly what does work, at least for them, and they're really excited about it. They can be, because of their life patterns of bumping, and they can also bump, not just have physical bumps, like when they're children. And that's another thing. When you're a child, things are more physical. Say with the third line, when you're a child, you might actually bump your head a lot and get bumps and bruises and scrapes a lot. But when you're older, those quote unquote bumps and bruises and scrapes might turn into emotional bumps and bruises and scrapes, or intellectual bumps and bruises and scrapes. But through that process, you discover. That's one of the main keynotes of the third line: discovery, being able to come to great discoveries with things. And a lot of it might be purely by accident, you know. But moving from the third line to the fourth line, now we are in the upper trigram, which is more transpersonal, better dealing with other people, even though the fourth line, it's still hugging, you could say, a lot of that lower trigram stuff of being personal. And it's an interesting sort of paradox with the fourth line. It's personal, but it's very transpersonal as well, and you'll discover a lot of that stuff when you start getting into profile and the incarnation crosses. How like the 4-6 profile, it might seem like it's a totally transpersonal profile, but it's still a right angle profile. And I won't get into all that in this talk, but It's still kind of a personal thing, but it's very good with people. It's kind of an interesting thing with the fourth line, that the fact that it's in the upper trigram now, it's not just bumping into people and having a bumpy ride with all that stuff that the third line is doing. It rests upon certain discoveries, and it is a networking machine. One of the keynotes of the fourth line is the opportunist, because it's waiting for the opportunity to externalize the first line foundations, the second line gifts, and the third line discoveries, to take that lower trigram and externalize it and bring it into more of an upper trigram transpersonal experience or awareness. It really helps, and it can move very cleanly between different groups of people and different experiences without it being like accidents happening, all these accidents that happen with the third line. It can be more smooth with all of that and more smooth with people. And it also has an assurance, kind of an assurance within itself. And one of the things I'll start bringing up here is that the lower trigram is related to the upper trigram, in that you could think of it as the first line being mirrored in the fourth line, and the second line being mirrored in the fifth line, and the third line being mirrored in the sixth line. These lines relate to one another in that sense. Say, like, the first line is the base of the lower trigram, in the same way that the fourth line is the base of the upper trigram. So these two lines, the first line and the fourth line, have a lot to do with foundational things and are very certain with how they're doing things, and they're very concerned about foundations, so to speak. But the fourth line is concerned about foundations in a different kind of way. It's more like an external foundation, externalizing foundations, and that's what they're really good for, like externalizing certainties and things that you could say the first line has already come to know and understand through that lower trigram process, and it's blooming through the first, second, and third lines. The fourth line takes all that and externalizes it. It's no longer an internal personal thing. It's externalized for other people, which is why, a lot of fourth line personalities might seem really certain with the things they talk about. And it's not to say that that's wrong. It's a kind of assurance. It's an assurance that you can feel, and a warmth that you can feel with a fourth line, in either bringing people together or being able to be a person that just seems like they have a good bearing on what's going on, and they're friendly. There's something about the fourth line that's just inherently friendly. I mean, it just came out of the third line experience, This movement of consciousness just came out of a lower trigram, third line, bumping into things experience. It's not bumping into things anymore. It's pretty smooth going, and it's really friendly. It's really upper trigram, you know, even though at the same time it still has a personal kind of makeup. It's funny the way Rod described the fourth line, and especially like the 4-6 profile. He's like, it's funny with these people because they're so friendly, they're so warm, people like to be around them, but it's a paradox because it's like, since they're so close to the lower trigram, they still carry elements of it. It's as if they're saying, come, 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 but please leave me alone. Come, 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 but please just give me my space. Come, come, oh, I love everyone, but just don't get on me too much. It's that kind of thing. And that is a funny thing with the fourth line. It is very sociable, but even it understands that social nature can lead to a lot of fatigue. Like, they can get tired of all the people all the time wanting to either be around them or you know what I mean, that kind of thing. They know they have a warm personality. They know they're good at networking. They know that a lot of people want to know what's up with them and what they're doing and how they're doing it, and that's cool and everything, but it can just sort of drive them a little, it can just make them tired of it after a certain point, and that's completely understandable. People enjoy having that first line certainty of a foundation being externalized. Which is why people want to know what's going on with the fourth line. What's happening? Because there's an externalizing factor to it of that first line certainty. Now, what's interesting is when we get to the fifth line is that this resonates with the second line of being a natural, but it's a natural in a transpersonal way, and it has to do with the mind. Sort of like how the second line has natural gifts with certain things, and it doesn't have to try so hard. The fifth line has certain natural gifts and doesn't have to try so hard, but it has more to do with the mental world and being able to see into the projection field of all these human beings, because what is the fifth line doing? It's resting upon that fourth line. It's resting upon that quote-unquote foundation of the upper trigram. And it's kind of a tricky thing with the fifth line, because people might look up to it in the same way a lot of people might look at the second line through that picture window in the lower trigram. That's one of the problems with the second line, is that people are looking through the window at it and see that it has a lot of gifts, it has a lot of this, and they might try to tell it to do things like, oh, you're really good at this, but at the same time the second line just wants to be left alone. Now see, some of this sort of carries over to the fifth line. It has all that, but it's more of a mind thing. It's not as personal as in the lower trigram. It does have very much to do with other people, and when people see that and looking into that quote-unquote window, it's as if they can't really see it. And the main keynote or title for the fifth line is the heretic. And why do they call it a heretic? It's because it brings a heresy, something totally new and totally different, that is a big change from the first line, fourth line expression, where things are really certain with the foundations, so to speak. The fifth line is one above that. In the same way, the second line is one above the first line and has natural gifts and can move more smoothly with things and just have a certain ability. It's the same thing with the fifth line, but with the fifth line it's different because it has to do with the transpersonal. The fifth line is the most transpersonal line. And there's a sort of an issue with that, because in the same way people are looking through the window at the second line thinking it can do things and being like, hey, you can do this, you can do that, you'd be really good at this. People sort of do the same thing with the fifth line, and it's a tricky kind of situation with the fifth line. So people sort of inherently look up to the fifth line to teach them things, show them things, help them with things, universalize things for them, or you could say to take care of things. A lot of people who have either like 5-1 profiles, not everyone, but I've noticed that people who do have 5-1 profiles, they can be natural teachers, or something like this, like something that people generally kind of look up to. But there's a problem with projection. I've talked about this issue in a few videos with the fifth line, because the fifth line is a slippery slope. It's the same thing that different systems and philosophies have been talking about for really thousands of years. The slippery slope of the human experience is always about the mind, all right? And it's even like this in human design. Even though they might harp on it a little too much, it's still basically true. The mind is the issue. The mind is the problem. You can't let the mind screw with you and all that kind of thing. Well, when you look at the hexagram structure, the fifth line is what really encapsulates a lot of that. It has a lot of ability, but it can get caught up in its own ability, really. It can just sort of get caught up in it. And but what's on the positive side of things, just like how the second line has abilities and these natural gifts, the fifth line has natural gifts, but they're transpersonal, meaning they really can deliver, they really can help people, and people can look up to a fifth line in this way to like bring things for them and help them with their gifts and their ability to universalize things that they might have went through, like if they're a 3-5 profile, for example, or you know, a 5'2" profile. But yeah, there's a lot going on with the fifth line. One of the keynotes of the fifth line is that it is the avatar or the general or the savior. It's really kind of seductive. It's seductive in the same way that the second line is seductive. Um, it's sort of like a sexual thing with the second line. It really is. But it's also a kind of sexual thing with the fifth line. You could think of the six lines as mapping to the chakras. Like the first line could be the first chakra of self and empowerment. The second line could map to the second chakra of passion and relationships, sexual stuff, generation. The third line would map to the third chakra of energy and experience, sort of a kinetic, how things rub together and there's sparks and stuff like that. A lot of discovery can come out of that. The fourth line could map to the fourth chakra, having to do with love and community. The fifth line mapping to the fifth chakra of power and projection. And being able to be that avatar that can lead and look into things very deeply and be there for people. But like I said, with the projection, there's a problem because you can't be all things for all people. And with the fifth line, it's either you're an angel or a demon a lot of times. Like people can really, really look at you and think they see something that might be just the right thing for them, but then it turns out that you're not, which means that you seduced them in a way that they don't appreciate, or you lied to them, or something like this. And a lot of issues with projection with the fifth line, which can actually lead to a victim mentality and a lot of paranoia in the fifth line if it feels it's constantly being projected upon, which eventually makes it not very trusting of people in general, which again is something that someone who either has a fifth line in their profile or a lot of fifth lines in their whole body graph will have to come to terms with and overcome somehow. But instead of getting hung up on the fifth line, which the fifth line is wont to do, I got a lot of fifth lines, so it's like, getting hung up on certain things, but whatever, it's a fifth line, it does what it does. When you get to the sixth line, the way Ra talks about the sixth line is really interesting to me. He says it's not really part of the hexagram. Everything's already been laid out, right? All the workings of the hexagram have already been um, laid out, all the way up to the fifth line. And the fifth line, you could say, is it's on the second floor of the house structure, like the fourth line is, and it's sort of looking out at the mass of people and how everybody's sort of thinking at their minds and everything, but the lights are turned off. Whereas in the first floor, the lights are turned on with the second line, and people can look in and see. But with the fifth line, it's a little kind of a different thing. But with the sixth line, it's interesting because you could say that it's on the roof. It's just relaxing upon all of this, and it's able to look at all the lines below it objectively and to just be able to see. One of the key words for the sixth line, you could say, is being an overseer and being a visionary and really thinking about, well, what can come next. And this is the interesting thing when you look at the hexagrams as they're arrayed around the zodiac wheel. The sixth line is forward looking, right? And you could say that, a high frequency of the sixth line is ahead of its time, meaning it's always looking ahead, like what could possibly come next. That's because it's on the roof and it's not necessarily concerned with all these inner workings of the hexagram below it. It's on the roof and looking ahead, looking forward, and that's why it can be quite a visionary in looking ahead and looking forward. Some of the negative qualities of it could be that it's a little too inaccessible and aloof. I mean, and this is within its own a person's own genetic expression and experience of this sixth line. They're not concerned with all the the ramblings and hoobajoop going on with the first 5 lines. A lot of it can just seem, they just don't feel like connecting with it. And that the quote-unquote disconnected nature of the 6th line can actually be kind of nice when they understand it. It's not that they're disconnected from reality, it just means that they have a connection to another one. They can look further and be really visionary, and they're not over encumbered by inner workings and processes that have already really been laid out and laid down, you know. So they can be maybe more spiritual, you know, more visionary, more able to look into a different reality, or look into a universal reality or the cosmos or whatever. But at the same time, they can be really objective. What's interesting about the 6th line, in that just in how the 1st line relates to the 4th, the 2nd relates to the 5th, the 6th line relates to the 3rd. Now, what do they have in common? Well, the 3rd line can have a lot to do with wisdom in having gone through all this stuff, right? The 3rd line, it experiences so many things in a single lifetime. Mistakes, having done things and discovered so many things and all this. The 6th line, you could say, is a higher octave of that. Now, when I say higher octave, I don't mean better. I don't mean it's better off. I don't mean it's whatever. I just mean it's a different octave of that kind of wisdom of having gone through so many experiences that you can sort of have a kind of wisdom about human experience itself, which is why the 6th line is the role model. And it's also why the 6th line, up until the Saturn return, it goes through a 3rd line phase. If you have a 6th line in your profile, before your Saturn return, up until the age of about 28, that 6th line actually experiences everything in a very 3rd line way. It goes through a lot of trial and error. It goes through a lot of experiences and things. And of course, it's great for the 6th line to have to do that, because in order for it to even be the role model, it has to go through all this stuff and understand the really kinetic inner workings of the hexagram. And when you think of the 3rd line, it is really sandwiched in the hexagram. Because if you think of the 6th line as being sort of separate from the hexagram, and that the hexagram itself, the inner workings of it are 1 through 5. When you look at the 3rd line, what is it? It's sandwiched right in between it. It's sandwiched between the 1 and the 2 and the 4 and the 5. It's right in the middle. So you could say it's very experiential in trying to balance things, balance experiences. And a lot of things can blow up in its face. It can get the bumps and scrapes and bruises. But the 6th line, it sort of has to go through a little 3rd line boot camp in the first 28 years of its life in order to gain a lot of experience. After that, it finally comes into itself as a role model and realizes, okay, I don't have to connect so much with that. I'm not going to have to be part of that kind of process forever. I can go into a different process of just what you could call embodiment. Embodying the whole hexagram in and of itself, in a way of being a role model, in the way of being an overseer. And, 6th lines could actually be, good teachers, but it's not as if they're playing a role of the 5th line, which make natural teachers and showing people things. It's as if the 6th line is teaching through merely being, in a sense. Being a pure role model and being a pure self. And a fully embodied self is what the 6th line teaches people. And it doesn't matter what they're doing. They might be a teacher. They might be a car mechanic. They might be an executive. They might be whatever. But what the 6th line exudes is a kind of beingness that is pure unto itself. Like, I am a fully embodied person. That's what you want to be. I'm not saying you got to be like me, but that's what you want to be. And it sort of resonates from them. When I'm around 6th-line personalities or people with 6 lines in their profile, you can feel like there's a role model quality to it. Be yourself. Be a whole self. Be unapologetically yourself. Just that pure being is what I really like about it. Now, there's one thing that I differ from Ra with when it comes to understanding the hexagrams. Now, some people might really, really disagree with this, and that's totally fine, but this is the only thing I change. I'm not changing anything major. It's not like this is a huge major part of human design that I'm tweaking and messing with. But Ra always contends that when going up the hexagram, the first line is yin, the second line is yang, the third line is yin, the fourth line is yang, the fifth line is yin, and the sixth line is yang. So from bottom up, it's yin, yang, yin, yang, yin, yang. Negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive. And the more I've contemplated the hexagram structure and everything, I mean, this isn't really a major part of human design. I mean, he might mention this once in a talk and going on to something else. It's not really something. But for me, conceptually, when looking at the meanings of all these lines, it feels to me it's best to just switch that. It really does. Like the first line is definitely more positive, in my opinion. And there's reasons for that. One reason is that, and this isn't even the primary reason, but when I got this book by Hua Qing Ni called The Book of Changes and the Unchanging Truth. This is 5,000 years of knowledge passed down from Taoists for thousands of years. And in this book, it's the same way that I'm saying it should be. It starts with yang at the bottom and then goes to yin. So the first line is yang, the second line is yin, third line is yang, fourth line is yin, fifth line is yang, sixth line is yin. Now that makes so much more sense when you understand the meanings of these lines themselves. I mean, everything I just described to you, it totally fits. I mean, I don't know why. I've had to explain this to a few people who, they might have a little cognitive dissonance if they've learned it the other way first from Ra, and then I tell them this other way, and they might have a little bit of a jarring moment like, but wait a minute. But it makes so much sense. What does the first line do? It's very piercing. It's very looking into things in that sense, in that masculine yang sense. It's the foundations of science, for goodness sakes, which has its roots in logic. And another, just another quick keynote is that you could think of the first through third lines of the lower trigram as being left, more left oriented in terms of the splenic area of the body graph, more left logical, more left and personal, right? Where you have things like the integration channels, which are very individualistic, meaning very personal. But when you get to the upper trigrams, you could think of that as being pulled more right toward the solar plexus, which is what? More communal, more having to do with humanity, and more having to do with groups of people and community and all that kind of thing, religion and what have you. But seeing as how, the first line is the foundation, it is very yang. It is very masculine. It's very concerned with the foundations of things. It's piercing into things and looking at things. It's very absorbed in processes. But when you look at the second line, remember how I said how each line rests upon the line after it, or before it? The second line rests upon that yang line, which makes it what? A very yin experience of just a kind of naturalness, which is one of the keynotes of the second line. It's just so natural. It's very flowing. It's very having to do with just being, a kind of beingness. and it might have natural gifts that just come to it. You know, it's not piercing into things like the first line is, and being really concerned and kind of anxious with the foundations of things and with its studies and its this and its that. It's just being, and you know, and it might have a lot of natural gifts and talents that just come out of nowhere in a very yin sense, in a very yin feminine sense. Things just happen very naturally with the second line, and it moves very smoothly, right? When you get to the third line, guess what? We're going into yang again. Now, what is it about the third line? It is very yang. It's a very kinetic experience. Things go bump with the third line. You know, things can, you know, the third line is always bumping into other people, bumping into other things. You know, when it's young, it's tripping over its shoelaces, bashing its head. I mean, people with third line personalities do hit their heads, can hit their heads more often than other kids and have accidents. But you know, it is a process of discovery. You know, in the same way the first line is piercing, the third line also pierces, but just in a different way. It's really kinetic, but you know, it's piercing in a different kind of way. When you get to the fourth line, what is it? It's resting upon that third line experience of all that kinetic stuff. And it's very yin. Again, the fourth line, in a way, is very natural, like the second line. It's very natural with people. It's very friendly. It's very warm. People like fourth lines. All very feminine. This is all very feminine. Like, this is why females are just really easy to talk to. And people, you know, it's sort of like, you know, one example might be how if you're a female and you're pretty to look at and people like to listen to you talk, you're probably going to get a lot more subscribers than a male would. I mean, that's just how it is. I'm not like super jealous or anything. Sometimes it can be annoying, especially if it's a really, really bad channel. But that's one of the things, like, females are just, that yin energy is really attractive. People really like it, and they're going to subscribe to it, almost no matter what you're talking about. So, you know, and there is kind of a networking quality to it, you know. Being able to pull things together and see different ways of looking at things and externalizing foundations and all that. It's all very yin. It's very natural, good with people, right? But when you get to the fifth line, what's the fifth line? Markedly masculine. Again, it's yang. It's piercing into the projection field. Now notice that the yang, the first, third, and fifth lines have to do with piercing, looking into things, having very like kinetic experiences, like with the third line, you know, uh, bumping into things, you know, and but when you look at the fifth line, it's piercing into the projection field, and it is masculine in the sense of it having keynotes like the general, people looking up to it like as somebody who's going to do something, like get the job done in a masculine kind of sense. People looking up to it as a pillar, either a pillar of the community, a pillar, and it doesn't mean like in your own neighborhood. It could be a pillar in other ways, whatever community, even online communities, or if you're in a heavy metal community and you have a lot of fifth lines, it might feel like you're a pillar or something like that, something that people can look up to, and it can become really known for things. You know, when people look up to a fifth line and the fifth line actually delivers the goods, it can become very well known. And you know, in that kind of sense, uh, in a sort of masculine way of being the leader. Now, I'm not saying women can't lead. You can have women who have a lot of fifth lines and who are good leaders, but there is a kind of, you know, uh, dynamic with this yin yang energy. You know, when you get to the sixth line, what is it? It's very yin again. It's markedly feminine because it's resting upon all the activity of the hexagram. It's just resting upon all of it. You could say it has no agenda with all the other stuff that's going on below. And it's interesting when you look at the first line of a hexagram, because one thing that somebody told me, like, but the first line is yin, because think of yin as the breathing in. Like, before you can breathe out, you have to breathe in. So the first line is the breathing in, and then the second line is the breathing out. And it's like, well, you could think of the sixth line as the one breathing in a sense, like, because seeing as how the sixth line isn't so connected to the operations of the whole hexagram, the sixth line you could think of as sort of the breathing in, and the first line of the next hexagram, that whole next hexagram that's coming after the sixth line, is the breathing out, the like the new experience, the blowing out into a whole new experience, a whole new foundation, a whole new way of looking at things, right? The sixth line, it almost has a kind of anticipation built into it. What's next? There's got to be more. There's got to be more than this. You know, that's why it's such a visionary. That's why it likes to look forward to things. That's why it's got all these things about it. It's the role model, right? It embodies the whole hexagram in a very yin way, in a very kind of natural way. It's just naturally itself, right? It doesn't have an agenda. It's not trying to pierce this and pierce that and look into this and look into that. That's not to say that people with six-line personalities can't be scientists and can't have experiences where they're looking into things. It just has to do with the generalness of this and the sort of continuity of how all these lines build upon one another. And you can very readily see this in the people who have these lines, especially, you know, when you're looking at profile with the sun earth placements. You can absolutely see this. You know, I've looked at it hundreds of times. It's very easy to see these in people. Now, as you can see, the lower trigram is predominantly yang, right? Because of the first and third lines, which are yang. When you look at the upper trigram, it's predominantly yin, right? With the fourth and sixth lines. Now, this is another reason why I think this is much better than seeing it the other way around, because the lower trigram being predominantly yang does tie it more to the left splenic side of ourselves. It ties it more to that personal self, right? The individual. But when you get to the upper trigram being predominantly yin, the upper trigram has everything to do with the transpersonal, dealing with people, connections between people, all very yin, very feminine. All very solar plexus as well, you know. It just makes much more sense to me, much more sense, you know. And you could also call this yin-yang structure of the hexagram the trigrams, seeing as how the 1, 3, and the 5 are related, so too are the 2, 4, and the 6 related. And these trigrams are illustrated in that video I did on the gene keys in human design trine systems. When you're looking at one line of a hexagram and you move 120 degrees away in both directions, you reach another line of 2 other hexagrams, and these lines are always within these trigrams of either the 1, 3, 5 relationship or a 2, 4, 6 relationship. And these lines of those hexagrams within these trines or trigrams, they communicate with each other in an interesting way like that. There are other ways of looking into the structure of the hexagram. One way would be looking at the bigrams. The bigrams being combinations of 1 and 2 being one bigram, 2 and 4 being another bigram, and 6 and 5 being another bigram. I'm not going to get so much into that because it's something I don't really contemplate that much. I mean, I've been contemplating this for a few years, but that's not an element that I look at. I'll put some links down there. I think Ra gets into it in his cartography course a little bit. I think understanding the hexagram structure or something. I think he might get a little into the bigrams, but I just don't get into it that much. But I just think it's real fascinating how you can look at a hexagram, and when you understand these basics, you can really start to decode it. You know, when you're looking at somebody's body graph or you're looking at your own, and you see your own profile with the Sun-Earth placements, the personality Sun-Earth and the design Sun-Earth. Now, these are the big ones when you want to understand how these lines affect your life. And you have 12 different profiles. Say your Sun Earth is within the 5th line of 2 hexagrams, because the Sun Earth is directly opposite of each other. They're always going to be in the same lines of different hexagrams, these programming partners that are mirror images of each other on opposite sides. Say, those are within the 5th line. And when you get to the design side, the Sun Earth is within the 2nd line of those hexagrams. So what you do is you just start to do what like people do with astrology or with Kabbalah or tarot, like people who are really love systems like this. You begin to superimpose meanings, and you just get better with this the more you do it. And I really like listening to how Ra would do it, because he just got so good at it after a certain point. Like he could really just run through all this stuff very effortlessly, and it's just even though I don't necessarily agree with every single thing, you don't have to agree, but the basic structure of things is what it is. You know what I mean? Even though I did the thing with the yin and yang that I just personally think makes more sense, that's not even a big deal in the big scheme of things with human design. The fact that I look at it like that, it's not a big deal. Yes, you could make the case the other way around. You could say, well, the first line is yin because it's introspective and all that. The second line is yang because these gifts are coming out of the self, which means it's more of a kinetic action that way. And the yin is more, the third line is more yin and introspective again and kind of thing. You could make the case either way. It's just that I prefer to look at it the way I just described to you, and not only that, it makes more sense for me that way through my own looking at it, but it also lines up with the Taoist teachings that are 5,000 years old. I just think that, I'm not saying you have to look at it the way I do. I just think it has a little bit more weight and makes a little bit more sense just to look at it that way. It's not even a big deal. I'm not changing the mechanics. I'm not changing things around the body graph, right? I'm not screwing with the whole system that some people hate. I mean, but nobody's doing that. Some people hate it when you talk about human design in conjunction with astrology, even though astrology is a big part of it. There's reasons why, why the hexagrams in fire signs are really fiery hexagrams. That's not just a coincidence, okay? Some people want to be like, you should never talk about astrology and human design together. It's like, well, why not? I mean, I'm not, it's not really that big of a deal. You look at the 21st hexagram in Aries. Why is the 21st hexagram such a fiery hexagram? There's nothing wrong with like making a few connections, or like the hexagrams that are in Capricorn. Why are those hexagrams in Capricorn so Capricorny? Why are the hexagrams that are in, Pisces so Pisces? Those are such Piscean hexagrams. Why are the hexagrams that are in Scorpio such scorpionic hexagrams? I mean, the first hexagram in the middle of Pisces, or the middle of Scorpio, you're going to tell me that's not scorpionic? Give me a break. There are connections to make, even though I do understand some people's gripes when you make too many connections and all that, but I don't go for the whole thing like, oh, if you're studying human design, you shouldn't even be looking at things like numerology or tarot or Kabbalah or Western astrology. It's just, that's overkill. People can juggle different systems if they want. It's not going to ruin their experience of human design. It's not like they'll never find out who they really are and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, this was just a quick rundown, quote unquote quick rundown of the lines, and I'll put some links down there to some courses you can take and some other PDFs like from Richard Rudd, who breaks down the lines in a couple different PDFs. I'll have to upload them to my website, but yeah, these are from Richard Rudd. And that's about it. So thanks for watching.